When I had just turned 12, my mom, Aunt Lisa, and I decided to celebrate my birthday at a big amusement park nearby. It was blazing hot that day, somewhere around 103 degrees Fahrenheit. We had been riding roller coasters and spinning rides for hours, and I was having the time of my life. But after a while, I started feeling lightheaded. My vision got all hazy, bright spots danced in front of me, and it felt like the world was tilting a bit. Not wanting to worry my mom or look weak, I didn't say anything to her. Instead, I mumbled that I needed to use the bathroom. In the restroom, as I tried to clear my head, a guy came in behind me and slipped into one of the stalls. At first, I did not think anything of it. I turned on the only working faucet, which barely trickled out hot water, and splashed what I could on my face. The dizziness was not gone, but I figured I could tough it out. I dried off with some paper towels and headed back to find my mom, hoping to squeeze in a few more rides before the day ended. Just as I stepped out, I noticed that the same guy from the bathroom came out right after me. About half an hour later, the dizziness crept back, this time stronger. I tried to ride another roller coaster with my mom, but even looking at it made my head spin. When I told her I was not feeling up to it, she looked a little concerned, but she went ahead since it was her favorite ride. My aunt stayed with me, keeping an eye on me while I tried to hold steady. Watching Mom soar up and down on that roller coaster only made my stomach churn, and before I knew it, I was leaning over a rail, throwing up. When the ride ended, Mom saw me and hurried over, asking if I was all right and if we should call it a day. I remember feeling so embarrassed, like admitting how bad I felt would ruin everything. I just shook my head and told her I needed another quick trip to the bathroom and that I wanted to stay. After all, we did not get out to the amusement park very often, and I did not want to cut the day short. Back in the restroom, I barely made it to a stall before I threw up again. After flushing, I shuffled over to the sink, trying to rinse the awful taste from my mouth. As I leaned over the sink, scrubbing my face, I heard someone rush past me. It was fast, like someone darting in a hurry. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the stall door creaking open and slamming shut. I ignored it at first, focusing on washing up, but something made me glance up at the mirror. There was a man, probably the same one from before, leaning toward the crack in his stall door. He was staring right at me through the tiny gap, his eyes locked on me. The moment he noticed I was looking, he jerked back, pretending to be busy with something in the stall. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I dashed out of the restroom as fast as I could, and to my horror, he walked out just moments after me, acting like everything was normal. This time, Mom seemed to notice something off. She kept me close and kept throwing worried glances over her shoulder. We went on a few more rides before I had to admit I needed the bathroom again. But this time, I actually had to go for real. I had been holding it for hours, too distracted to use the restroom properly. Mom agreed, though she asked me to be quick about it since it was getting late. I rushed back to the restroom and settled in one of the stalls. After a few minutes, I heard the bathroom door swing open with a loud bang. Heavy footsteps started making their way toward the stalls. A surge of panic shot through me, and I instinctively lifted my feet off the ground, hoping whoever was there would not see me. The footsteps stopped right outside my stall, and I could hear his breathing, heavy and deliberate, like he was waiting for me to react. He stood there, breathing through the door for what felt like an eternity. I was holding my breath, trying not to make a sound, my heart racing. Then, just as suddenly, he turned and walked away. Only when I felt sure he was gone did I dare lower my feet and finish up, my hands shaking. I washed up as quickly as I could, and when I got back to my mom and Aunt Lisa, I felt a weird relief just being close to them. But as we walked around, I could not shake the feeling that someone was following us. I kept glancing back, scanning the crowd, but the guy was nowhere in sight. Part of me thought I was being paranoid, maybe just feeling sick from the heat and the rides. Still, something was gnawing at me. We moved to the food area, and while my mom and aunt were distracted with ordering snacks, I looked around again. Then out of the corner of my eye, I spotted him. He was just standing near the edge of the crowd watching us. His face was blank, almost like he was trying to blend in, but his eyes were fixed on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt like I could not breathe. I turned back to my mom, tugging on her sleeve. She looked at me concerned and asked if I was all right. I was about to tell her what I had seen, but the words just would not come out. I shook my head and told her I was fine. As we sat down with our snacks, I kept looking around, trying to spot him again. For a while, everything felt normal, like maybe I had imagined it. But just as we were finishing up, I saw him again, standing closer this time, watching us from behind a row of game booths. It was like he was just waiting for a moment when I was alone. I felt a wave of dread, and I told my mom I wanted to stick close to her for the rest of the day. She gave me a strange look, but she agreed and pulled me close, her arm around my shoulder. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the park, making everything look eerie. We decided to try one last ride before we headed out, a big Ferris wheel that offered a view of the entire park. As we climbed into the small cabin, I kept glancing back to see if the man was still there, but he had vanished again. I tried to relax, telling myself it was all in my head. The Ferris wheel started moving, slowly taking us up higher, and for a moment I felt safe, like nothing could reach me. But as we reached the top, I happened to look down, and there he was. He was standing right below, directly under our cabin, staring up at me. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, knowing I would see him from up high. His face was emotionless, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt trapped, like a caged animal with no way out. My mom noticed me going pale and asked what was wrong, but all I could do was point down. She looked but saw nothing, only the crowd moving around like normal. I kept looking back, expecting to see him disappear into the crowd, but he just stood there waiting. When we finally got off the ride, I felt a wave of relief, thinking maybe it was over. But as we walked out of the ride area, I saw him again, only now he was closer. It was as if each time I saw him, he was a few steps nearer, getting bolder, more deliberate. I told my mom I wanted to go home. She seemed surprised but nodded, saying it was getting late anyway. As we made our way to the exit, I could feel my heart pounding, knowing I had to get out of there. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like he was right behind me. At one point, I swear I saw him out of the corner of my eye, moving through the crowd like a shadow, always in my peripheral vision. It felt like a nightmare, like no matter how fast I walked, he was just out of reach, waiting for the right moment. Finally, we reached the parking lot and I felt like I could breathe again. The car was just a few steps away. I thought we had made it. I thought we were safe. But then, as my mom unlocked the car, I looked back one last time. He was there, standing just outside the entrance of the park, watching us with that same blank stare. We got into the car and I kept my eyes locked on that figure by the entrance, watching to see if he would move or follow us. But he just stood there, staring. I wanted to tell my mom everything, but I felt frozen, unsure of how to explain it. I tried convincing myself that it was all in my head, that I was just sick from the heat and too many rides. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I felt a strange combination of relief and dread, like I was finally free but still in danger. The drive home was quiet, and every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see him following us somehow. But the road stayed empty, and eventually I started to relax, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. We finally got home, and I headed straight for my room, wanting nothing more than to shake off the whole day and get some sleep. But when I lay down, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to stop thinking about that man. His face kept flashing in my mind, his expression cold and unreadable, like he was studying me. I closed my eyes trying to block it out, but the image would not go away. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember, I was jolted awake by a strange sound coming from outside my window. My room was on the second floor, so I tried to tell myself it was just a branch scraping against the glass or some animal passing by. But the noise continued, a soft tapping, steady and deliberate. I got up, feeling my heart race, and slowly walked to the window. I was half expecting to see nothing but shadows, just a trick of my imagination. But when I looked out, my blood ran cold. There, standing in the dim light of the street lamp, was the man from the amusement park. He was standing in the street, staring up at my window, his eyes locked on mine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How did he find me? How did he know where I lived? I stumbled back from the window, my hands shaking, and tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he was just some random guy passing by. But deep down, I knew better. He was there for me. I ran to my mom's room and woke her up, babbling about the man outside. She looked at me, half asleep and confused, and asked if I was sure. When I dragged her to my window to look, the street was empty. There was no sign of him. My mom gave me a sympathetic look, chalking it up to a bad dream and maybe too much excitement from the day. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but inside I felt a creeping sense of dread. I went back to bed, lying there wide awake, listening for any sound that might mean he had come back. Hours went by and the house stayed silent, but I still felt on edge, like I was being watched. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was all a bad dream, that maybe I had imagined it out of fear. I got ready for school, hoping the routine would help me forget. But as I headed out the door, I felt that same prickle of fear running up my spine. I turned around, scanning the street, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No strange man, no signs of anyone lurking around. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my nerves. The day went by slowly, and I tried to focus on my classes, but I could not get him out of my mind. Every time I looked up, it felt like I might see him standing just outside the door, waiting for me. I jumped at every sound, every shadow, feeling like he was right there, just out of sight. When the final bell rang, I practically ran out of the school, my eyes darting around, half expecting him to be waiting for me. But the street was empty, and I forced myself to walk home slowly, trying to act normal. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like he was just around the corner, watching me. When I got home, I double-checked that all the doors were locked, and even checked the windows to make sure they were secure. I told myself I was safe here, that he would not come back. But as the sun started to set, I felt that familiar dread creeping over me. I kept looking out the window, watching for any sign of movement. Just as darkness settled over the neighborhood, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the end of our driveway. My heart started pounding as I strained to see through the shadows. And then I saw him, standing there, his figure barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. He was back. I froze, watching him from the window. He was just standing at the end of the driveway, almost hidden by the shadows, but I knew it was him. The way he stood, perfectly still, just staring at the house, sent a chill through me. My mind raced with what I should do, but I was too scared to move, too scared to even look away. I forced myself to turn and went straight to my mom, trying to stay calm. When I told her he was back standing outside, she gave me a worried look but did not seem to believe me. She thought it was just another leftover fear from the day before and tried to reassure me, saying maybe I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But I knew what I had seen. I was not imagining it. Determined to prove it, I grabbed her hand and pulled her to the window, pointing out to where he was. But by the time we looked, he was gone. I felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over me. I could not understand how he kept disappearing like that, leaving no trace behind. Mom patted my shoulder, trying to calm me down, and told me to get some rest. She said I was probably just tired and still not feeling well. Reluctantly, I went to my room, but I did not even bother to change into pajamas. I just sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the window, waiting. The hours ticked by, and as I sat in the darkness, every creak and shadow seemed like a sign he was back. I kept telling myself that it would be fine, that maybe he really was gone, but I could not shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Finally, sometime after midnight, I heard something, a faint rustling outside my window like someone stepping on dry leaves. I held my breath, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time. Slowly, I got up and crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. When I peeked through the blinds, I felt my stomach drop. He was there, just outside, close enough that I could see his face in the faint moonlight. He was looking straight up at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. There was nowhere for me to hide, and I could not even scream. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Desperately, I ran to my door and locked it, hoping that somehow that would keep him out. I sat against the door, hugging my knees to my chest, waiting for the sun to rise, afraid to even close my eyes. The whole house felt tense and silent, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. When morning finally came, I went downstairs, barely able to keep my eyes open, and found my mom already up. She took one look at me and frowned, asking if I had slept at all. I just shook my head, feeling too drained to explain. All I could think about was how close he had been, how he had somehow found my home. Mom told me to take it easy and maybe stay inside for the day. She seemed to think it was just leftover fear, but I knew it was more than that. I could feel it. The day passed slowly, with me glancing out the window every few minutes, expecting to see him standing there again. But he did not show up. By evening, I started to relax, convincing myself that maybe he really was gone this time. I even managed to eat dinner without looking over my shoulder every 5 seconds. But as night fell, that feeling of dread crept back in. I tried to distract myself, turning on the television and drowning out the silence with noise. I thought if I just ignored it, I could pretend everything was fine. Then, just as I was starting to feel a little normal, I heard it, the faint, steady tapping on my window. It was soft at first, like it could have been the wind, but the rhythm was too even, too deliberate. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and looked at the window, half hoping I was imagining it. But he was there, standing right outside my window, his hand tapping against the glass. I felt my blood run cold as I stared at him, frozen in place. His face was pale and expressionless, like he was looking right through me. I knew I could not ignore it anymore. This was not a coincidence, and he was not just some random stranger. He had followed me, tracked me down, and now he was outside my window, like he was waiting for something. I scrambled away from the window, finally breaking free from the fear that had held me in place. I knew I had to tell my mom, that she had to believe me this time. I ran out of my room, calling for her, my voice trembling. When she came running, I pointed to the window, telling her he was back, that he was right outside. She rushed to the window, but when she looked, he was gone. The empty street stared back at us, silent and still. Mom gave me a worried look, telling me we would talk about it in the morning, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I went back to my room, my stomach twisting with fear and frustration. I knew what I had seen. He was real, and he was not going away. I did not sleep at all that night. I just sat by my door, my back pressed against it, waiting for some sound, some clue that he was still out there. My mind kept replaying the image of his face at the window, that cold, empty stare that seemed to pierce right through me. It felt like he was always just a step behind, waiting for the right moment. Morning finally came, but it brought no relief. I was exhausted, my head pounding, but the fear kept me on edge. When I went downstairs, my mom noticed my pale face and tired eyes and looked genuinely concerned. She insisted that I stay home from school, that maybe some rest would help me get back to normal. I nodded, pretending to agree, but I knew rest would not change anything. I had to figure out who this man was and why he was following me. My mom went out to run errands, promising to be back in an hour, and I was left alone in the quiet house. For the first time, I felt like I could try to confront whatever this was. I paced through the rooms, checking all the locks and peeking out the windows, half expecting to see him lurking somewhere in the shadows. But the street was empty, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet. Then a thought struck me. Maybe he was not just some stranger. Maybe he was connected to something I did not remember. It seemed impossible, but I could not shake the feeling that he had been watching me for longer than I realized. I tried to think back, to remember if I had seen him before that day at the amusement park, but nothing came to mind. I was standing by the living room window, lost in thought, when I heard it. The soft creak of a floorboard upstairs. My heart stopped. I was the only one home. I held my breath, listening. Another creak, closer this time, like someone was moving down the hallway. I felt a surge of panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. Slowly, I backed away from the window and moved toward the front door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from upstairs, and it sounded like my name. My blood ran cold, but something compelled me to turn around and look. And then, standing at the top of the stairs, was the man. He was inside my house. He just stood there, his face expressionless, his eyes locked on mine. I could not move, could not speak. The room seemed to close in around me, and all I could do was stare back, frozen in place. Slowly, he started coming down the stairs, one step at a time, never breaking eye contact. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my legs would not move. I felt like a rabbit caught in a trap, helpless and terrified. He was halfway down the stairs when my survival instincts finally kicked in. I turned and bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady and unhurried, like he knew there was no escape. Just as I threw open the door and stumbled outside, I felt a hand brush against my shoulder, barely missing me. I ran down the driveway, not daring to look back, and did not stop until I was halfway down the street. When I finally turned around, he was gone. I kept running until I reached a neighbor's house, pounding on the door, gasping for breath. They looked at me, alarmed, as I babbled about the man in my house. They called the police, and within minutes, 2 officers arrived, their faces serious as they listened to my story. They searched the house from top to bottom, every room, every closet, but they found nothing. There was no sign of him, no evidence that anyone had been there. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The officers assured me that they would patrol the area, that they would be watching, but their words felt hollow, empty. They could not understand what I was feeling, that this was not just some random intruder. He was different, something darker, something relentless. The next few days passed in a blur. I barely slept, barely ate, jumping at every sound, every shadow. My mom was worried, but I could not tell her the truth. She would never believe me, and honestly, I barely believed it myself. I started seeing him everywhere, in reflections and shadows in the corner of my eye. It was like he was haunting me, slipping in and out of my life just to keep me on edge, to remind me that he was never far away. I could feel him, always watching, always waiting. One night I decided I could not take it anymore. I could not keep living like this, in constant fear. I made up my mind to confront him, to make him stop. I stayed awake, waiting, listening to every creak and groan of the house, determined to face him once and for all. Around midnight, I heard it, the faint tapping on my window. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked to the window, opening it slowly. The night was dark and silent, but I knew he was out there. I whispered into the darkness, telling him to leave me alone, to let me go. For a long moment, there was only silence. But then, just as I was about to close the window, I heard his voice, soft and chilling, coming from the shadows. "I am always here," he whispered. "I will always be here." I slammed the window shut, my hands shaking, and backed away. I could still feel his presence, like a cold shadow pressing down on me, suffocating me. I do not know how long he will stay, how long he will haunt me, but I know one thing for sure: he is never truly gone.